All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. So tonight, local Guttenberg resident David Jurman will be interviewing New Jersey-based author Rick Laughland about his book, The Subway Series, New York City's Illustrious Baseball Tradition. So before we begin, just one quick note. Please keep your questions until the end of the presentation. You can write them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that throughout the evening, and at the end of the presentation, I'll read all of your questions out loud. So our author tonight is Rick Laughland. Rick has been front and center in the New York sports scene as a beat reporter for various media outlets over the past decade. Laughland's work has been featured online via Fox Sports and CBS Sports, along with broadcast appearances in New York and New Jersey. He operates an independent New York Mets blog and maintains Brooklyn Nets coverage, with syndication on Bleacher Report, Hoops Hype, and Yardbarker. His first book, A History of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn, was published in 2022. He currently serves as an adjunct professor of marketing at his alma mater, Riley Dickinson University. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our interviewer for the evening, David Jurman.
Chelsea, thank you. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you to the North Bergen Public Library. I want to first start off by asking Rick, you previously wrote a book about the history of the NBA and ABA Nets. Tell me why you wrote this book.
And this book, just to clarify, David, this book as in the Subway series or the Nets
The
book?
Subway Series book.
Oh,
Yes.
sure, no problem. So, and it's a funny parallel. I'm glad you mentioned that, David. Is there, we have a generation of fans that, going back to that first book I wrote, A History of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn, that did not even know the Nets as the New Jersey Nets. Nevertheless, the history that preceded that, being the New York Nets in Long Island, their first inaugural year known as the New Jersey Americans. So I felt compelled for that first book to write a contiguous history, tell the entire history of a franchise that's really seldom celebrated, often overlooked, and really did have some very legendary players, seminal moments throughout the course of franchise history. And I felt it was important. There have been books written specifically about certain eras, but to go start to finish. And kind of in the same vein, again, even if you're aged 25 or older, all if you're talking about Subway Series is New York Mets and New York Yankees starting in 1997, when in reality there is a whole 140 plus year history to the New York City baseball rivalry, that the early iterations of the Subway Series going back to the late 19th century. And so I felt that it was important because unfortunately, the years have gone on, the advancement in technology, there's less emphasis on history, on reading, and I felt that this was important for not only the generation that lived through that or had heard from their parents or grandparents about the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants, but also for this generation of the younger baseball fans to understand where these franchises, the deep history they have, and where the Subway Series really had originated many years ago.
So the Subway Series origins go back, as you mentioned, even in the 1800s, but in the quote modern era, going back to 1903. Could you kind of describe its beginnings and what teams were participants starting in 1903?
And again, David, it's funny trying to boil this down so it's easy to understand because there's so many iterations. I mean, if you talk about what eventually became the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they got their name, of course, because when the Subway Series came to be, it wasn't even known as the Subway Series. So it preceded the subway system in New York City. It preceded the actual, the consolidation of what became the greater New York City area, the five boroughs, and it became known as the Trolley Series. So there were early iterations of what teams ended up being the Brooklyn Dodgers, known as the Bridegrooms, the Grays, the Robins, and then eventually sticking with the Dodgers from 1931 on. And the Giants the same, starting as the New York Gotham. So that was the earliest, if you want to call it the Brooklyn Baseball Club, which was also originally an American Association club, then transferred over to the National League. That is where the heart of the rivalry started, was between Brooklyn and New York City, that being meant the Bronx really, and Manhattan eventually as well when the Yankees came into the picture. But essentially, and so essentially there are so many different iterations of the Giants and the Dodgers. What we, I guess, delineate as the actual first Subway World Series, okay, that's what really started happening at the 1903, because as we know, that's what we consider the modern, the modern era of the World Series. And the Yankees came into the picture, of course, started as the Highlanders. They really had some humble beginnings for a franchise that became as storied as it was and left this indelible impact on the sport, the winningest franchise in all of sports, especially in baseball. But that wasn't the case at the turn of the 19th century. And you see that in just this fierce rivalry that developed between the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants. And the one thing I will give credit to Walter O'Malley and Horace Stoneham is that when the teams did move to the West Coast, they had to be in lockstep. They had to be aligned. It wasn't one could move without the other. They understood the importance of that rivalry, which was an intra-city rivalry when they were based in New York. But I would argue, even after they moved to the West Coast, both of those teams, that the actual level of play, the caliber of play, especially on the Dodgers side, went up and up and up. And they understood that there was such a history there that you couldn't move one team without the other. Even though Brooklynites and New York Giants fans were completely heartbroken when that happened, but really the 1921 World Series, if you want to call it that, was the start of the early Subway World Series, these Subway Series battles between each league.
You talk about the Yankees and they've had all these championships and so forth. But prior to 1920 and Babe Ruth coming to the Yankees, the New York Giants were the dominant team in New York, right?
Absolutely correct. Yes, and again, the Giants had storied players. They were the toast of the town, and it was really the bridegrooms, or whatever version of the Dodgers you want to call it, the Brooklyn Baseball Club, kind of trying to banging their head against the wall, could never topple the Giants. And eventually, of course, the Yankees come into this, and it becomes a three-team New York City landscape. And the Yankees, they're basically co-tenants with the Giants. Okay, and they're trying to build their own stadium, which they eventually successful at doing. It's an exorbitant price tag. At the time, it's thought, boy, do they, have they established themselves enough to fill a stadium to be able to justify the cost of what's involved with that? And sure enough, that's probably inarguably the best decision the franchise ever made, was to break away from the Giants and that being leasees at the Polo Grounds, because that relationship became pretty strained. The Giants issued a temporary eviction notice to the Yankees, then they rescinded it. But there was some bad blood that was developing, during those early years when the Yankees were starting to, gain some traction and gain some steam and start to kind of take the mantle from the New York Giants as the toast of the New York City baseball town. But when they eventually did open Yankee Stadium, and of course winning a World Series, getting onto the radar and starting to become not just a threat to New York Giants, but usurping them as the powerhouse in the metropolitan area, that's when you saw a changing of the guard. And unfortunately, the Brooklyn franchise that was beloved by Brooklynites, that they could do no wrong, even though they were labeled as lovable losers by famed cartoonists. You could never say that if you weren't a Dodger fan, but the Dodger fans themselves just had this special connection to that team, even though they were not just second fiddle to the Giants most times, they were third fiddle, because even when they did topple the Giants, they weren't able to topple the Yankees most times. So it was a very interesting dynamic that played out. And again, and I know that generation of fans that were able to see that three-team intra-city rivalry between those clubs. That to me is the golden era of baseball, and I'm not sure we'll ever see that again.
I think the Brooklyn Dodgers, more so even than the Yankees and the Giants, were interwoven into the fabric of their community. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. And without showing too many cards, because, obviously I'd love for everybody to read in the book themselves, but I had the opportunity to interview Carl Erskine, who has since passed away. He was the last living member of the Boys of Summer. He was 92 years of age, sharp as a tack, could remember conversations with Jackie Robinson like it was yesterday. He formed an early kinship and friendship with him going back to spring training when he first was trying to break in with the big league club. And it was Jackie Robinson that really gave him that extra confidence boost that he needed. He said, he faced Jackie Robinson a lot of inter squad games, and basically Jackie told him, you have the stuff to compete. Just believe, have a little more belief and just trust the process and what you have to go through. And sure enough, he, became an integral member of those teams that were constantly vying with the Giants and challenging the Yankees ultimately for a World Series. And he talks about the idea that when the Dodgers moved along with the Giants to the West Coast and the Dodgers going to LA, which he took that move with them, that it felt like a divorce, that Brooklynites were just besides themselves. They couldn't believe, they felt so betrayed. It was like they were spurned. And that relationship for many, they couldn't follow that team to the West Coast. Some of them didn't follow them to the West Coast. Some said, I can't root for the Yankees. It was a dark period where there was between 1958 and when the Mets arrived in 62, where they'd rather not root for any team than root for the Yankees. So it's really an interesting, it should be a case study on sports fandom and that special connection that Brooklynites had to that Dodger team. And I can't quite put my finger on it. I will say that because they were a lunch pail type of team and they really, were lovable losers, let's face it, they were always third fiddle to the Giants in the early years and then eventually the Yankees, that they had that David versus Goliath type of dynamic that, it just became such an attachment that Brooklynites and then ironically, you have the 1955 World Series and culminates in the Brooklyn Dodgers finally toppling the Yankees. And then 2 short seasons later, it's so anticlimactic because the team is uprooted, rips the hearts out of Brooklynites, and moves to the West Coast. So, talk about the highs of highs and the lows of lows. If you were an original Brooklyn Dodger fan, or maybe heard stories from grandparents or parents or relatives, only they could truly express what that meant when that team left Brooklyn.
Your book does a wonderful job. You talked about the 1800s and then the establishment in 1903 of the modern era. And your book really does a wonderful job of delineating all of that history beautifully because can get very confusing with the different leagues that were started in the late 1800s and so forth. And then going into the early 20th century, it's a very smooth transition in your book. I want to move forward now to post World War II because then the rivalry really ratcheted up. From 47 until 1958, every year, with the exception of 1948, there was one New York team of those three in the World Series, which is amazing. And you mentioned before about golden age of baseball. I don't know if New York sports will ever see something like that in terms of intensity. And you talk about the Dodgers and Giants wanting to beat the Yankees, but really, even more intense was the Dodger versus Giant rivalry. In those days, only 8 teams in the National League, 8 teams in the American League. So you played your opponent maybe like 18 times or somewhere along those lines. So, can you talk about that golden era of baseball, not only just from the standpoint of the Yankees versus the Giants and the Yankees versus the Dodgers, but that intensity of the Dodgers versus the Giants during the time frame when both teams were fantastic with superstar players?
Yeah, and Carl Erskine describes it perfectly in the book when I interviewed him. He understood the magnitude of the moment when the Dodgers would those rare times they would break through and win the National League and face the Yankees. They understood what was at stake, a championship. But he even still before his dying day, unfortunately, admitted that those Giants and Dodgers games was when, and he, to use his phrase, when your manhood was on the line, that there was just such a sense of pride and that you couldn't let the other side that was your bitter rival, like you mentioned, David, playing each other 18 times during the regular season, that it was almost unthinkable to lose a game like that. He became very good friends with Willie Mays. And of course, we know about the shot heard around the world with Bobby Thompson. And he tells a funny story about how Willie Mays admits years after that they knew they were stealing signs, that being the Giants. And Carl Erskine said, "Well, yeah, that's normal practice in baseball. It's been done for now centuries." He said, "No, we actually had a telescope in the bullpen window, and we were relaying signs. And they had laughed about it years after. But when he was in that moment, and they were in those trenches, so to speak. And speaking of trenches, I know you mentioned I talked a lot about the late 1800s and the early 20th century." But I just felt it was important to kind of interweave a lot of what was going on in the country at that time, starting with the infrastructure of what we now see in New York City. We see it as so, antiquated and so outdated. But that was really the start of the subway system, the interconnectedness of the borough. That's what made things so much more special, to be able to, take a short bus ride or a subway, or when the cars were operating trolleys to a baseball game, and to hear the roar of a crowd over the McCombs Dam Bridge to Yankee Stadium to the Polo Grounds. It just, like you, to your point, David, it just reached, in my mind, a New York City baseball fever pitch to have those three teams and playing at a high level. I mean, the Dodgers, had more downtime certainly than the Yankees and Giants. There were a lot of similarities between those Dodgers teams, from 41 to 57, as we see with the modern era New York Mets, that they will have some times when they make the World Series in 2015 and the year 2000, and they make the playoffs in back-to-back years for the first time in 2015 and 16 in franchise history. But there's a lot more lows than there are highs. But just like the Mets, where they challenged the Yankees in that 2000 Subway World Series, the Dodgers always put up a good fight, always pushing them to 6 or 7 games. And so, to your point, David, I don't think we'll ever see, even if there were 4 teams in New York City one day, which won't happen, just for real estate purposes and infrastructure and traffic alone, I still don't think you'll see what you saw between 1941 and 1957 every year. The one game, at least a few games from the World Series being based in New York City. It was truly incredible, and probably deserving. And there have been many documentaries, many books just written about that era alone. So that was one of the challenges for as an author for me, was trying to give enough level of detail and enough leave enough of a legacy of that era and of the players that played during that golden era, because I had to keep the timeline moving, if you could say so.
Well, one of the special things about the book, and I think this is something that's going to particularly benefit the young reader, is the fact that you intertwine New York history. As you mentioned before, you wrote about what was going on during the time frames that you talk about historically in New York as well. And I think that really gives added impact to the book. Could you talk about that and why you made that decision to kind of add historical context to your sports narrative?
Yes, so I felt as though when I wrote the history of the Nets book, it was very much based on the team, what was happening around the team, and it did not, somewhat purposefully, because let's face it, there's only a certain amount of words that you can use in a book, right? That a publisher is going to allow you to. I overshot that by tens of thousands. We still were able to go into print, and there were no problems. But to cover everything that was going on in the country, and all the different moves the Nets had, the 8 different arenas they played in. If you want to say 9, because they played at the Hofstra Physical Fitness Center when they had a ABA playoff game, whatever the case may be. So I felt it was important in this book because there's no history like baseball history. There's no history like New York City history, to have that kind of interwoven and to make a generation, particularly, again, many, myself had lived through, a good chunk of what's in the book. David, I'm sure you lived through a bit more than I have, and then there's others that have preceded that. This younger generation, I'm talking, of college age or younger, may or may not know how many of these players, notable players. I mean, Yogi Berra, firing on German U-boats from Normandy Beach, and the fact that they had this civil duty to serve their country, whether they were fighting in foreign wars on, overseas, or whether they were serving in military baseball academies. So yes, it was a different time, but I felt it was very important to kind of on a macro level make people understand what was happening in this country. A lot, there was a lot of civil unrest, a lot of social unrest, but a lot of great cultural things, as far as, the Prohibition era and the how that bore a new brand of music in jazz and Creole language, and all the things, all these great artful forms that were popping up and cropping up all over the country. It was really a beautiful time and a Renaissance period for this country. But with some of the good came a lot of bad. And I felt that it's important that baseball, through it all, has made it. There's been a couple of work stoppages. We mentioned with the work stoppage in 1994 and earlier prior to that, and maybe staring at another work stoppage. But by and large, for 99% of those years, baseball has endured. It's been the pastime of this country during wartime, during social unrest, during civil unrest. So that was kind of the underlying message and motif and theme that I wanted to drive through, that baseball was really always a constant, no matter how high or low spirits were in the country, the economy, and boosting troops' morale overseas. It really is just an uplifting sort of idea that baseball, no matter what's going on, you can think romantically about it.
Now, you can't talk about baseball in New York after World War II without talking about the topic of race. And certainly Jackie Robinson in 1947 breaking the color barrier, but then also Willie Mays soon after coming to the New York Giants. But the New York Yankees do not have a black ball player until Elston Howard in 1955. 8 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. Could you talk about race in baseball during that time frame?
Yeah, and Branch Rickey is really the first that wanted to integrate the major leagues, and he was a general manager, and the job of a general manager, and Carl Erskine alludes to this. I've seen Willie Mays in interviews as well, that his job was to find talent wherever it was, and it was really not even a little known secret. It was really widely publicized. There were some great black athletes that were playing in the Negro Leagues prior to the integration of baseball that just didn't have a level, not even a level playing field, an opportunity to showcase their skills. So when Branch Rickey started basically making headway in developing scouting systems and minor league systems that were, pooling Negro League players with the intention of bringing them up, yes, he had some altruistic motivation to that because, of course, integrating and making this a socially connected country was important. But there was also a part to it where he wanted the best players on the diamond possible, and he knew that you were ignoring a whole subsegment of players just because of their race, and that was really A, not fair, and B, infecting the performance of the team. So when he was able to do that, and ultimately has Jackie Robinson become the first black athlete to integrate baseball, you have teams following suit. Larry Doby becomes the first to integrate the American League. Just like you said with Elston Howard, I think he was the first to hit a walk-off home run in World Series history, and that's 8 years after Jackie. Well, Larry Doby is really kind of a forgotten name in baseball history. I mean, there have been a couple of books, more than a couple, written about him since, MLB's second man. But he is, and he was awarded posthumously with a Congressional Medal of Honor for that. But I think people kind of grasp the magnitude of when Jackie was called up and he made his major league debut. But ultimately, when they were on the road, there was a lot of racial tension. I mean, Leo DeRocher, who was really integral in trying to help players feel more comfortable in a clubhouse that may have had some resistance to fans that may have said off-color remarks that made them feel uncomfortable. He was one that tried to assimilate a clubhouse and really tried to stop any bigotry in its tracks. But that was the harsh reality, was that, that was what they endured during that time. And Carl Erskine, he formed that early friendship with Jackie Robinson. He grew up in a mixed neighborhood in Anderson, Indiana. He basically had from a young age every type of race, different friends from different races, so to speak. So he was one of those locker room clubhouse leaders that wanted to make sure, yes, they were integrated, but were the white players accepting of players like Jackie Robinson or Larry Doby? Because let's face it, they're thinking about their own job security, and they're maybe threatened because here come these up and coming Negro League players that could possibly take their job. So there was a lot of friction at that time. But again, this is stuff that preceded Brown versus Board of Education, all the Civil Rights Act, all these things that were going on in the country. It really started the social movement and what became the civil rights movement. But along with that, there's a lot, as we know, and we've experienced some social unrest in recent years during COVID and so on, and will continue to in the future, I'm sure. But with any type of change, there becomes resistance to that change, and then there's ultimately, unfortunately, friction and fighting, and that's what we've seen in recent years and also saw back then. But there was also an intrigue level, because when Jackie Robinson would go around the country and play at Wrigley Field, say, the stadium would be packed, but then there would be 10, 15, almost 20,000 people outside just to say you were there. I mean, it was just an incredible, momentous moment in this country's history. And again, you want to say that Earl Lloyd was the first black player to play in basketball, which is certainly momentous. And that had its own impact in that sport, but nothing to me from the sports that I've covered and researched and read the history of had the impact that Jackie Robinson did when he integrated baseball.
Now, you talked about the Dodgers leaving Brooklyn. They went out to Los Angeles, of course. And that same year, after the 1957 season, the New York Giants leave New York, heading for San Francisco, where they both are to this present day. In 1962, though, New York once again becomes both an American League and National League town. How did the establishment of the New York Mets with their first season in 1962 occur?
And it's funny, it's two familiar names that I may have not mentioned in this interview, but I mentioned in the book several times. And one of them I did mention is Branch Rickey. And he becomes an integral part, along with a name that's probably familiar to a lot of Mets fans, William Shea, in basically starting what amounts to be a league, a continental league that is adversarial to MLB. And they're basically, he has an intention of competing directly with MLB in part because of how the Dodgers and Giants were basically uprooted and left, and there was only the Yankees as the only show in town. He saw an opportunity to establish a New York City baseball team in a competing league. And when MLB got wind of this, just like anything, with when the ABA first came around in 1967, the NBA was not necessarily threatened by that. There's a lot that's involved in running a professional sports league, media contracts and such, and it's a lot of deep pockets that have to go into keeping teams operating. So once the ABA started gaining traction, and that took several years to get some legitimacy, then all of a sudden you started hearing talks of a merger and the NBA wanting the ABA to dissolve because they were, from a business perspective, starting to grab some market share, if you want to call it that. But oddly enough, William Shea and as well as Branch Rickey start exploring this, and they start establishing these charter cities that are become the Continental League. And all of a sudden, MLB nixes that and says, "Look, we're going to award New York a franchise, okay, and we're going to give a franchise to Houston." And there was the Washington franchise, which eventually moved to Minnesota, and then Washington comes back as the Senators. They started basically saying, "Don't compete with us. We'll give you what you want," and that is how the New York Mets are born. And Joan Whitney Payson, who was a minority owner of the New York Giants at the time, she had saw firsthand exactly how heartbreaking it was for the Giants to leave to the West Coast. So she becomes an ambassador and a beloved figure in early New York Mets history. And so the Mets, when they came to town, just like the Brooklyn Dodgers, they had some early growing pains, didn't exactly tear the cover off the baseball, but I think National League fans of New York baseball, and they had that dark period starting in from 1958 till 60, with the end of 61, when there was no New York City baseball team other than the Yankees, and Dodgers and Giants fans weren't going to just jump on that bandwagon willingly. Some did, but not a lot. When the Mets came to town, there was a lot of excitement and fanfare. And the Mets were not a winning ball club, really, up until the 1968 and miracle season of 1969, when they became known as the Miracle Mets. So that's how the franchise came to be, the New York Mets. It was a long time running to get some legitimacy, but there was a lot of fanfare, hoopla, and excitement when it became at least a two-city baseball town. They were never going to get that third team. Maybe in another 5 or 10 years if baseball expands. But for that time being, from 1962 until what we see today, I think fans are at least somewhat satisfied that the Yankees weren't the only show in town.
It's interesting. After the Giants and Dodgers left for California, you would have thought there would have been a spike in Yankee attendance just by virtue of the fact that they were the only game in town. If you wanted to see Major League Baseball until the Mets came around, you had to only to go to a Yankee game, yet their attendance actually decreased after the Giants and Dodgers left, which is really interesting. And some people argue even when the Mets came into existence, you couldn't see Major League Baseball because they were so horrible their first season with 120 losses, which was the most losses ever in the history of baseball until recently. The Chicago White Sox lost 121 games. But that being said, the Mets come in, they're playing in the National League. the Yankees are playing in the American League, but they don't play each other because they're separate leagues and the leagues only face each other in the World Series, which in my mind really made the World Series very, very special because these were teams seeing each other for the first time. And during those years, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you could actually delineate the two leagues in terms of style of play. American League teams played in these old, smaller bandbox stadiums that were very home run friendly, like Yankee Stadium and so forth. While the National League, particularly starting with what we call the cookie cutter stadiums, which were the multi purpose stadiums, were these cavernous, huge stadiums built for baseball and football, but very hard to hit home runs in. So you had teams like the St. Louis Cardinals built their team with speed, and it was a much more fast game with those two leagues. So there was a real interesting delineation between the two. But then finally in the 1990s, the idea comes to actually have interleague play in the regular season. And there were certain purists who were very much against it because of what I just talked about with the difference between the leagues. But there's no question that it's been, particularly on the business side, a tremendous success. So, 97, the Yankees and Mets are going to play each other for the first time ever in a regular season game. I happened to be at that game at Yankee Stadium, and the Mets won 6-0. It was very interesting because I was just curious how many Met fans would be there, what the atmosphere was. And I remember walking into the stadium and it was electric. It felt like it was a postseason game, yet here it was just a regular season game between the two. Can you discuss those early years of interleague play between the Mets and Yankees?
And it's funny, David, because there was a lot of resistance to interleague play, but it goes back to there was different formats and iterations and discussions about interleague play going back to the 1903 season. And really, what became the modern interleague play format was most closely resembled the Cleveland Indians general manager Hank Greenberg at the time is a 1956 proposal that is really the closest to what we see in the modern Subway Series era. And as you mentioned, David, that I am jealous that you were at that game because I've heard firsthand, from Susan Waldman, who now, all these years later has covered hundreds, thousands of Yankees games and World Series games, ALCS games, perfect games, all sorts of momentous moments. And she alludes to the fact that Dave Malicki, the starter in that game, throwing basically the game of his life, the Mets winning that first ever Mets Yankees version of the Subway World Series, and how special it was that, she saw players, including Dave Malicki and others, taking dirt from the field and putting in their pocket to probably put into a plaque or some kind of a commemorative case to have for the rest of their lives and give it to their children and children's children. That's how much it meant to have the New York Mets back and playing, back in New York City, but, they had been there since 1962, but basically at least a rivalry back in New York City that meant something in the regular season standings. So the fact that the Mets were, let's face it, for the majority of their existence up until that point, they win the 69 World Series. They, oddly and ironically enough, have the best opening day record of any Major League Baseball team, and that's in spite of them losing their first 6 opening days. So from 1962 all the way up to 1968, it lost all those opening day contests. Then finally win in 1969. They have all these great players coming up in the 80s, and Darryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden. They become the toast of the town. They add key veterans and Keith Hernandez, and they add Gary Carter. And of course, they win the 1986 World Series in a dysfunctional but very Met-like fashion that, as soon as you count them out, they come from 6 feet under and win the series. Look like they're going to lose game 6. And it looks as though the Mets are going to basically take over New York City from the Yankees. And what happens is Frank Cashen at the time, as the general manager, sees all this locker room discourse and dysfunction and all the off the field things that were going on, and says to himself, "This is not sustainable. We have to break up pieces of this team." And Kevin Mitchell and others, and the team gets back to the '88 NLCS. They lose to the Dodgers in dramatic fashion, and basically have those early '90s seasons are some lean years up until 97 rolls around with the interleague and Subway Series, if you call it that. And that really reinvigorated the fan base. And Bobby Valentine is the manager at the time, and Joe Torre That starts what ends up culminating in the 2000 Subway World Series, which is really a David versus Goliath matchup that to the current day. So from 2000 up until 2026, maybe it could happen this year. Very unlikely with the way the Mets are playing. You never know. It's baseball. But still, we still haven't seen that again. The Mets and Yankees play in the World Series like they did in the year 2000.
Yes. The 2000 World Series, first time Mets playing the Yankees in the World Series. The intensity and the excitement in New York was just unbelievable. And the drama of that World Series. Although the Yankees won in five, it was a much closer World Series than that, with a lot of games decided by a run. One incident that really stood out and kind of signifies the intensity of the rivalry during that time frame was the incident with Mike Piazza and Roger Clemens in the World Series.
Absolutely. And I had a couple different perspectives on this, and I know a lot of Mets fans wanted Mike Piazza to maybe stand up for himself and do a little more in that situation where, of course, he's has the bat tossed in his direction in game two. They lose game one in heartbreaking fashion. Timo Perez, of course, not running around the bases and not and getting gunned down at home plate on a beautiful relay throw from Derek Jeter. Armando Benitez blowing a save. They lose in extra innings in exasperating fashion. And then you have the sideshow, which becomes Roger Clemens throwing a splintered bat in Piazza's direction. And Steve Phillips and Bobby Valentine, who both have interviews in the book, came out in the same kind of perspective was the Mets couldn't afford to lose Mike Piazza. If he went and charged the mound or started a brouhaha that led to several fines and suspensions, the Mets were already at a talent deficit. Okay, the Yankees were at that point, they won in 96, won in 98, won in 99. They were chasing what would have been four World Series in 5 years that they ultimately captured. But if the Mets lost Mike Piazza for even a game in that series, that would have basically almost been a nail in the coffin. So Piazza, from his standpoint, did not maybe go over the line, get suspended. Could you make the argument that maybe a Lenny Harris or somebody else could have stepped in there and made some noise or thrown a few pushbacks? Sure, but that didn't
Mm-hmm.
happen, and the Mets come back and almost win that series. Matt Franco, I should say. The Mets come back and almost win that game. You have Jay Payton hitting a 3-run home run. They bring the tying run to the plate. Mariano Rivera looks completely rattled. So to your point, David, even in a game when the Mets were down big, 7 runs, they made it close in the end, and it's the second slimmest margin of victory for a 5-game series, that Mets Yankees Subway World Series in 2000. Each game could have went either way. But at the end of the day, it's the Yankees, their championship pedigree, the 4 World Series in 5 years, and the Mets just being the upstart David versus Goliath. It came to rear its ugly head in the biggest moments in those tight spots late in innings, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the Yankee experience definitely made a difference. Yes, the Mets were in the postseason the year before being eliminated by the Braves, but the Yankees had all that experience going back really to 95 when they first played in the wild card. And I think that really helped them. What was frustrating for Met fans was on paper, the Mets had the better record that year. The Yankees actually were struggling even to get to the World Series. They actually finished under 90 wins. And it looked like that Met team, which finished a game behind the Braves, could have taken them. That being said, though, the experience of the Yankees in those big moments, in those games that came down to a 1 run or a key at bat or whatever, were the better team, and we saw that throughout that World Series. And it's interesting because that was the same thing that happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers during those great Yankee Dodgers series of the 50s. There was always some kind of Yankee clutch hit or a clutch catch by Billy Martin in one of those games that always was a deciding factor that put the Yankees over the top, and history repeated itself in 2000. This book is truly the definitive history of the Subway Series rivalry. Really, no book goes in depth and is backed by the definitive research that you did with this book. Why does this rivalry still, here we are since 97, still playing these interleague games, and they still draw sellout crowds year after year? Why do you think the intensity of the Subway Series has not lessened at all over the years?
And you mentioned it, David. So when you talk about the parallels between those Brooklyn Dodgers teams and the Mets, it's absolutely true that they oftentimes when they did get to the mountaintop, there was the Yankees always punching down on them, but they didn't go down without a fight. That was certainly true in that 2000 Subway World Series. Just to take a quick aside to our earlier conversation, it's funny because the Brooklyn Dodgers, they were original American Association team. Their ballpark was built in almost a different way than a lot of the National League ballparks of that era, where you did have sort of a bandbox. And Carl Erskine talks about he actually felt more comfortable pitching at Ebbets Field because you had short distances down the line. That the Dodgers, they had such prolific lineups, okay, with Duke Schneider, and the list goes on and on and on, Campanella, but he felt that he would have such run support that he didn't have a small margin for error, so he could pitch a little more freely. If he gave up a single here or a solo home run there, it wasn't going to break his back. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That maybe the only variation or deviation from the Mets and the Dodgers was how the ballpark was constructed, and even the roster construction. The Dodgers had some great pitchers. I'm not going to shortchange that, but they also had some pretty prolific lineups. Whereas that Mets team specifically in 2000 and what we've seen really largely over their history has been built on the backs of starting pitching, timely hitting, and when the let's face it, when the pitcher hit in the National League and there was no designated hitter, it was even more small ball, which has changed in recent years. But to get back to your point about the history and why it's so important, it's funny because the interconnectedness, even though the Dodgers and Giants were quote unquote, one's in San Francisco, one's in Los Angeles. You lost the interconnectedness of the boroughs, just like people are going to work today or going out to eat or restaurants and bars. And you're, seeing people, if it's Mets and Yankees gear or Mets gear, there's nowhere to hide. If your team loses and you have a Mets hat on and you're leaving a restaurant after, watching the game on the TV or a bar or a watch party, you're going to hear it from the other side. So it's that bragging rights, that pride that's on the line. And I understood their perspective because both Joe Torre and Steve Phillips, but also Bobby Valentine felt this way. They were excited, as was everybody in '97, when this meant, oh my goodness, the Mets and Yankees going to play at that time 6 times a year. This is great. But when a couple of years went by and they played in the Subway World Series in 2000, and then by the time 2001 rolled around, it almost was though they got a little burned out. They being Bobby Valentine, the manager of the Mets, and Joe Torre, because there was so much more fan excitement and media hoopla and interviews. A normal press conference and maybe have a smattering of 5 or 10 reporters now had 30 or 40 because it was just Mets Yankees. So selfishly, I think they were a little the Mets and specifically Bobby Valentine didn't like the idea of playing 6 more games against the best team in baseball, that being those dynastic Yankees teams, but also answering all the media questions, everything like that. But from a fan perspective, it was everything you could ask for and more. And the Mets and Yankees in the Subway World Series, when they moved to what's now Citi Field and the new Yankee Stadium, there was, after the Yankees won the 2009 World Series, there was kind of a downturn, not as much interest in the Subway Series as there was in early years. But that in recent years, starting with COVID and with the Juan Soto signing across town, that has certainly been magnified and back on the uptick. So I think to answer your question in a long-winded way, David, this is probably, we're reaching a point now where if we were ever to get a Mets and Yankees Subway World Series matchup, and with all the bad blood that has developed over the years, maybe that even matches up to what it was in 2000. I think that's how much vitriol and how much disdain Mets and Yankees fans have for each other.
Question the Juan Soto signing has ratcheted up because I think that's the first time that the Mets actually, in an offseason move, really upstaged the Yankees. Certainly, have always been competing for players, but here was a player, a superstar that both of them wanted. And history would have shown that normally he would have probably stayed with the Yankees because of the success of the team, the history, and everything. And the Mets getting him away from the Yankees, a player of that stature, really has intensified the rivalry even more so in my mind. We have some questions that some of our viewers have. I have one final question before we get to those. What was the Mayor's Trophy game?
Well, they had early era Mayor's Trophy game, if you want to call it that, going back to the 60s essentially. And really, Bobby Valentine describes it as glorified exhibition. It was fun for the fans. It didn't necessarily mean anything in the standings. And it kind of in a microcosm like the Subway interleague play, the Subway series when the Mets and Yankees played in '97, there was a lot of interest. Attendance was was great, and people were intrigued that, the first couple of years. And then after that, the newness kind of wore off and it kind of fizzled out. So you saw what ended up being essentially it fizzes out, okay, and then it ultimately dissolves. So it goes from 63 to 79. There's a period where it's not played, and then the 82 and 83 seasons, and then it goes dark. So from 83 up until the Mets and Yankees play again in 1997, that's when interleague play and there's two New York City teams playing against each other. But for that time, it was exciting. It was fun. You had silly things with with basically the New York City mayor putting together these trophies that were awarded to the winning team to kind of stir the pot. So was it a little bit of overhyped and was it to generate excitement? Sure. But because there was history in New York City with baseball and they had so many clashes between the Giants and the Yankees and the Dodgers at the time, they kind of rekindled a lot of the bad blood, if you want to call it that, the competitive fire that those teams had. So for a while, it whet people's appetite and baseball fans' appetites. But by 83, it kind of fizzed out and then reached a fever pitch in 1997 when the game started having meaning again.
Elsie, I know we have about 13 minutes left. Can I turn it over to you for questions?
Absolutely. So we do have some questions already in the chat box. And if anyone has any additional questions, please put them in the chat box at this point. So Rick, tell us more about how the Brooklyn Dodgers became both a social force and a commercial force to a major expansion of the fan base for MLB with Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, so again, there were altruistic motivations for Branch Rickey, but they understood the magnitude. And I'm going to face the realities of this. There was a marketing advantage to say that we're the first to have a black athlete play in baseball. So they leaned into that heavily. And because of those, Jackie Robinson, of course, was on the 1955 team that finally toppled the Yankees. Oddly enough, didn't start. Was Walter Alston did not start him in that final game because he basically came off the bench and hit because he wanted to go with more defense. And the Yankees ultimately lose that game. The Dodgers become finally, I mean, it was more so than jubilation and celebration in 1955. It was almost relief that they were finally able to say, we got the monkey off our back, and that monkey being the New York Yankees. So from a marketability standpoint, I talked about, as a famed cartoonist called them the lovable losers. They were always, whether it's the papers of the day, the Brooklyn Eagle. You also had the fact that they were labeled the boys of summer, and they had these prolific offensive teams. And Jackie Robinson was right in the middle of that. We know, of course, against the Yankees stealing home plate in a World Series game was just monumental and a seminal moment. And because Jackie Robinson did have a larger than life personality, he was beloved. Again, initially there was resistance from not only fans and people covering the team, but also, within his own clubhouse. But eventually he won all those people over as well. So because Jackie had a larger than life personality and persona and was just such a man of character, and, we see his legacy now every April 15th. It's just an incredible story and a legacy that he left for himself. And you see him prominently displayed in the Citi Field Rotunda, which has touches of Ebbets Field and the brick facade. And when you go in and you see famous quotes from him and sayings and seminal moments he had during his Brooklyn Dodgers career, that's what makes it a lasting legacy. And of course, the number 42 sculpture that's there as well. Really, some players in certain sports, it becomes Michael Jordan for his performance, or in football becomes Joe Namath for, of course, making the AFL and the NFL, helping to usher in that merger and legitimizing that league. But Jackie Robinson, his impact, say what you want to say about the performance of Michael Jordan being the greatest of all time and Joe Namath helping to merge those leagues. No impact was larger than what Jackie Robinson did. To be able to have the courage to endure some of the hatred and the vitriol that was pointed in his direction is truly incredible. And it's a human interest story that transcends sports. So you started getting, and it really, what it did is cultivated a new generation at that time of black players that saw a pathway to play in the major leagues, that said, I didn't even know this was an option, it was always segregated. So now what we see in baseball, and the percentage of African Americans in baseball, still not what it should be. It's still small in comparison to white players and Hispanic born players, but there's still, you have to give him credit along with Larry Doby for kind of paving the way for the black athlete in baseball.
Excellent, thank you. The next question. Do you see a parallel between the Brooklyn Dodgers of 1947 through 1957 and the Atlanta Braves of their 14-season consecutive division championship streak, which was from 1991 to 2005?
That's pretty interesting. And the Mets, unfortunately, well, all those NL East teams, those being, of course, the Mets and the Phillies and the Marlins, and during some of that time before the Washington Nationals came into the picture in the early 2000s, that the Expos, the Braves were basically the toast of the NL East, and they're winning the division time and time again. So those Atlanta teams that were built around starting pitching with Tom Glavine and Greg Maddux and John Smoltz, and the list goes on and on and on, they were really a powerhouse team in the National League. And then when they got up against the Yankees, of course, they lose to them in 1996 despite having a 2-0 lead, and they lose four straight. They were heavily favored. They actually won two games on the road in Yankee Stadium, came back to game three. Of course, Jim Leyritz, they're coming back from 6-0 in that game. I believe Jim Leyritz hits a huge home run in the eighth inning, and away the Yankees go on their dynasty. Who knows if that game maybe goes a little differently and Atlanta wins, maybe they become a team that wins, four out of the next five World Series. You never know. But I don't think the Brooklyn Dodgers ever reached that level of just consistency and dominance that those Atlanta Braves teams, despite the fact that they didn't have that extended, success in the playoffs and the postseason. They made a few World Series. They lost two to the Yankees, beating the Minnesota Twins, but I see some comparisons, but I just think the Dodgers are more similar to the Mets because they have a lot more peaks and valleys than you saw with those Atlanta teams from what would have been, 91 to 2003.
Excellent, thank you. So our next thing in the comment box is actually a comment rather than a question, but if you have some words to say about this as well. You spoke of Branch Rickey's ability to discover talent. He discovered a major league sensation when he was coaching college baseball at the University of Michigan and brought him to his first MLB team, the only statue outside Busch Stadium of a player who never played for the St. Louis Cardinals.
So that's interesting. You're going to have to give me more context on that.
Absolutely. In the meantime, we're going to jump ahead to the next question. How did the National Historic Landmark Hinchlife Stadium in Paterson, New Jersey, which served as the home field for the New York Black Yankees, factor into the baseball history of New York?
Yeah, it's interesting, and they've actually just renovated that in Paterson, New Jersey. And Larry Doby, so Larry Doby was actually very close with Joseph Taub, who they both were from Paterson. Larry Doby served for many years as the public relations community relations director for the New Jersey Nets. They were very involved in giving back to youth communities and giving back to their hometown of Paterson. So you could see that Hinchcliffe Stadium, which started to become, frankly, dilapidated, decrepit, was neglected for many years, has just been built up. And of course, was home to a Negro League team, was significant and it's been registered as a historic landmark, was significant in the fact that, many of the black players of the day had a place as a training ground to be able to eventually break into the major leagues when Jackie did that. So I think that, baseball, and they finally, this happened 2 years ago. I think it was in 2024 that baseball finally merged the records from acknowledge those Negro League records and acknowledge them in Major League Baseball records because there were some unbelievable players from back in the day. So Hinchcliffe Stadium, historic landmark, to cite to many players that went on had storied careers in baseball. So the fact that at least these local municipalities and towns and voters and mayors are seeing the value and significance of preserving these landmarks, that's heartening to see because far too many times, we've seen, of course, the original Yankee Stadium being demolished in favor of what we see now, which is really catered more towards corporate clients and more luxury seating. But there's certain things that, you can't, from a monetary perspective, even if maybe doesn't make sense in the budget because of its historical significance, and then allowing it to be able to at least, be used in the modern day is wonderful to see. So I'm glad that they were able to get that project approved and be able to renovate it to the level they were.
Perfect, thank you. And just to give you a little bit of context for the comment from earlier, the player was George Sisler. Branch Rickey coached him at the University of Michigan and made him the foundation of the St. Louis Browns.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, and Ricky had that's one of the things about Branch Rickey was that he had a storied history as a general manager, and he was a well-respected GM, and really his legacy was linked to Jackie Robinson. But essentially, yeah, he started as I believe, the manager player with the St. Louis Browns, and then a manager with them. So, I'm not surprised. There's probably, if they do a lot of coaching trees. Let's look at the Bill Belichick coaching tree, the Andy Reid coaching tree. If you did a coaching tree of Branch Rickey, and not just a coaching tree, but just a tree in general of all the executives that worked under him that became executives, or people that became coaches, or Negro League players that made it to the baseball, or or professional players that he recruited from other circuits that became legendary players, I bet you that would be a 100-page list. So Rickey was an absolute visionary. He did an unbelievable thing by integrating baseball. And I'm not shocked. Like I said, I'd love to. Unfortunately, we only have a certain amount of time today, but you could probably rattle off 100 or more names that you would probably recognize that ultimately linked back to Branch Rickey.
That's amazing. Thank you. So it looks like that's the last of the questions that we had in the chat box. So I wanted to finish up this evening by first thanking our audience for coming out and spending time with us this evening. I wanted to say a big thank you to David for volunteering his time to run this interview, and a big thank you to Rick for again volunteering his time to come out and giving us this very educational and informative presentation. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you very
You,
much. And
Chelsea, for having us. We really appreciate it.
thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, David. And David, I just want to make an acknowledgement. David was really, really helpful along the process. I consider David a local historian, so any of the baseball knowledge that predates my time, David filled in those gaps along with some of the interviews I did. So I'm very grateful for that and for having me tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Rick. It's a wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes,
you
thank
again.
you both. And thank you everyone for coming out this evening. Everybody have an excellent night. Take care.